The Book of Enoch presents a truth about human creation that was not accepted. This truth was not refuted. It was forbidden. What was concealed was not fantasy. It was interpretation. For centuries, this text circulated among Jewish communities of the Second Temple, preserved in Aramaic, Greek, and finally Ethiopian, while disappearing from dominant traditions. Its exclusion did not happen due to theological irrelevance or factual error. It happened because its portrayal of human origins crossed boundaries considered acceptable between heaven, earth, and consciousness. The problem was never creation. It was access to knowledge before its time. The disturbing thing is not the text. The disturbing thing is the portrait of humanity it preserves. If you seek understanding, and not filtered versions, continue. The prohibition of ancient texts was never a simple or uniform process. When we speak of canon, we are not only talking about theological decisions, but about institutional control over narratives that shape the collective understanding of reality. The formation of the biblical canon was a political and religious process that lasted for centuries, involving disputes between different rabbinical schools, early Christian communities, and later, ecclesiastical councils. The criteria for inclusion or exclusion were rarely purely doctrinal. Texts were evaluated for their antiquity, attributed authorship, liturgical use, and, crucially, for their ability to reinforce or destabilize structures of authority. The Book of Enoch was excluded not because its claims were considered false, but because they were dangerous. There was a clear difference between texts that were simply ignored and texts that were actively suppressed. Enoch fell into the latter category. The reason was clear to those who controlled the interpretation of sacred texts. Narratives about human origins were extremely sensitive. They defined not only where we came from, but what we are, what our function is in the cosmos, and what our relationship is with the divine. Altering this narrative meant altering the very basis of collective identity. The Book of Enoch not only offered an alternative version of creation, it complicated it in an unacceptable way. It introduced elements that made humanity less a direct and exclusive product of divine will, and more the result of a process contaminated by external intervention, by the transmission of forbidden knowledge, and by a structural flaw in the celestial order. This could not be integrated into the official narrative without compromising the entire theological edifice that was being built. Knowledge was never erased. It was restricted, and the Book of Enoch survived outside the mainstream, preserved by those who saw in it something that could not be lost. Entire communities kept this text alive through handwritten copies, oral transmission, and deliberate protection against those who would seek to destroy it. It was not merely a historical document. It was a testament to something that religious authorities preferred to keep hidden. And the more time passed, the clearer it became that its exclusion had not been accidental. It had been strategic. Enoch, in Hebrew tradition, was a unique figure. Genesis dedicates only a few verses to him, but they are enough to create a mystery. He lived 365 years, walked with God, and did not experience death. God took him. This narrative brevity is intentional. Enoch did not die like the other patriarchs. He was translated, removed from the earth while still alive, a fate reserved only for him and, later, for the prophet Elijah. This uniqueness made him a figure of intense speculation in Second Temple Judaism. If Enoch was taken to heaven, what did he see there? What did he learn? What secrets did he bring back before his final departure? These questions generated an entire Enochian literature, of which the first book of Enoch is the oldest and most complete expression. This text has been preserved in its entirety only in the Ethiopian tradition, where the Ethiopian Orthodox Church considers it canonical to this day. For centuries, Western scholars knew the Book of Enoch only through fragmentary quotations in early Christian writings. Clement of Alexandria quoted Enoch. Tertullian defended him. Origen mentioned him. But the complete text remained inaccessible. Then, in the mid-18th century, the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 copies of the Ethiopian manuscript back to Europe, and the text began to be translated and studied. The impact was immediate. Scholars realized they were facing something much older and more significant than they had imagined. But it was only in the 20th century, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the antiquity and importance of Enoch were irrefutably confirmed. Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch were found in Qumran, dating from before the Christian period, some going back to the 3rd or 2nd century BCE. This meant that the text was not a late or marginal creation. It was a central work, read and copied by rigorous and literate Jewish communities. The Qumran community did not preserve irrelevant texts. They were selective, careful, committed to what they considered essential for understanding the divine will and human history. And Enoch was among their priority texts. It is not a peripheral text, it is an uncomfortable text. What makes the Book of Enoch disturbing is not its descriptions of fallen angels or its apocalyptic visions. The disturbing aspect lies in how it portrays human creation. In Genesis, humanity is formed from the dust of the earth and animated by the divine breath. We are God's direct creation, made in His image and likeness, placed in the garden with a single prohibition: not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The transgression is human, the temptation external, but the choice is ours. The responsibility falls on Adam and Eve. They disobeyed, ate the forbidden fruit, and brought death and suffering into the world. This narrative is clear, direct, and places the blame firmly on human shoulders. Enoch preserves an earlier or parallel layer of this narrative. He does not contradict Genesis, he expands upon it. And in this expansion, human creation appears as a project with a specific function, inserted into a complex cosmic order where knowledge should not have been transmitted before its proper time. Humanity does not transgress on its own. It is corrupted. And this corruption comes from above, not from below. It comes from beings who should have remained separate, but who chose to descend, mingle, and, worse, teach. The Watchers are central to this narrative. They are described as celestial beings sent to observe humanity, but who transgress their function. They descend, take human women, father Nephilim, and, crucially, transmit knowledge that should not be revealed. This is not just about magic or sorcery. The text is specific. They teach metallurgy, the manufacture of weapons and tools, cosmetics and adornments, the reading of celestial signs and the movements of the stars, writing and the secrets of letters, pharmacology, and the manipulation of roots and plants for healing and poison. They transmit technology. They transmit applied knowledge. And this destabilizes the order. Humanity, which should evolve according to a set pace, is given premature access to tools for radical transformation. The problem is not knowledge itself. The problem is the timing. Human consciousness emerges before the moral maturity necessary to contain it. Humans learn to forge swords before understanding when not to use them. They learn to handle poisonous plants before developing wisdom about when to preserve life. They learn to read the heavens before understanding that not all knowledge should be applied immediately. The result is chaos, violence, domination, environmental destruction, widespread war. This is drastically different from the canonical Genesis, but it doesn't contradict it. In Genesis, humanity is punished for seeking knowledge. In Enoch, humanity is corrupted by receiving it before it is ready. Both texts agree on a central point. Access to knowledge without preparation leads to destruction. The difference lies in the emphasis. Genesis places the responsibility on human choice. Enoch places the responsibility on celestial transgression. But the result is the same. The flood comes. Order is restored by force. Excessive knowledge is punished with near total extinction. Remain until the end. The parallels with other ancient texts are no coincidence. Genesis 6 briefly mentions the sons of God who took the daughters of men, begetting the Nephilim. The Hebrew text is ambiguous, deliberately vague, as if there were hesitation in fully developing this narrative. But ancient Jewish tradition understood these sons of God as celestial beings. They were not simply powerful men or noble lineages. They were entities of another order, crossing boundaries that should not be crossed. The Book of Jubilees, another Second Temple text, repeats and expands the narrative of the Watchers, detailing their descent, their names, their specific transgressions. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments of texts that further develop this theme, including the Book of Giants, which narrates the consequences of the union between Watchers and humans. The Qumran community, which preserved these manuscripts, clearly considered the story of the Watchers as an integral part of its cosmology. They did not see it as legend. They saw it as a historical explanation for the human condition. For them, the corruption of the world was not merely the result of individual human choices, it was the result of structural contamination, a breakdown in the cosmic order that had introduced destructive elements into creation. And this understanding shaped everything: their ethics, their theology, their vision of the end times. Even more striking is the presence of this pattern in Gnostic Christian texts, discovered in Nag Hammadi in the 20th century. Gospels such as those of Thomas and Philip, and especially texts like the Apocryphon of John, present a vision of human creation where knowledge and liberation are intimately linked, but where premature or uncontrolled access to this knowledge generates chaos. For the Gnostics, the problem was not knowledge itself. It was the power structure that controlled access to it and the human inability to understand it without guidance. Knowledge could liberate, but it could also enslave. It could enlighten, but it could also destroy. Everything depended on the context, the preparation, and the maturity of the one who received it. This is deeper than it seems. What connects all these texts, from Enoch to the Gnostic Gospels, is a shared understanding. The texts do not contradict each other. They reveal different levels of the same origin. Genesis offers the public, accessible, controlled narrative. It is the simplified version, intended for mass consumption, constructed to establish basic moral principles without delving into complexities that could generate confusion or excessive questioning. Enoch offers the esoteric narrative, preserved in circles that had access to older oral traditions or interpretations considered dangerous. It is the version for those who could handle ambiguity, apparent contradiction, and questions without easy answers. The Gnostics radicalize this interpretation, transforming knowledge into an instrument of salvation, but always recognizing that it can destroy as much as it liberates. For them, the demiurge, the imperfect creator of the material world, deliberately kept humanity in ignorance. Knowledge was the key to escaping this prison. But this knowledge was not superficial information. It was gnosis, a profound understanding of the nature of reality, of the self, of the divine. And achieving it required preparation, discipline, inner transformation. Without this, knowledge did not liberate. It only confused. Humanity is not merely creation, it is experiment. And the experiment failed not because we were poorly designed, but because we were given tools for which we were not prepared. This is the central message that runs through Enoch, Jubilees, the Qumran texts, and Gnostic literature. And it is a message that canonical traditions could not integrate without compromising their own authority. The narrative escalation in Enoch is deliberate and unsettling. First, the Watchers descend and mingle with humanity. This is already a transgression, but still controllable. It's a boundary breach, but one that could, theoretically, be reversed. Then, they transmit knowledge. This is irreversible. From that moment on, humanity can no longer return to a state of innocence. Knowledge, once transmitted, cannot be erased. Technology, once created, cannot be forgotten. Consciousness, once expanded, cannot be retracted. You can destroy books, burn libraries, silence teachers, but the idea has already been planted. The seed has already germinated, and it will continue to grow. The result is widespread violence. The Nephilim dominate the earth, devour its resources, wage war amongst themselves and against ordinary humanity. The world becomes unsustainable. The earth cries out under the weight of destruction. Resources are depleted. The ecological balance collapses. The social structure disintegrates. And then comes judgment. The flood in Enoch is not arbitrary divine punishment. It is not the fury of an offended God who decides to punish ungrateful creatures. It is a structural response to a systemic collapse. Order has been broken. Creation has been contaminated. The only solution is a new beginning. But here's the disturbing detail. Knowledge isn't completely destroyed. It's preserved. Noah, in later traditions, is described as carrying with him not only his family and animals, but also books, written knowledge, techniques that must survive the flood. Post-Diluvian humanity doesn't start from scratch. It begins with memory, and that memory includes the warning. Knowledge has always demanded limits. Transgression was both intellectual and moral. Judgment arises when boundaries are broken. History isn't erased. It's preserved as a lesson, as a warning, as a testament to what happens when wisdom doesn't accompany power. This pattern repeats itself throughout the biblical and apocryphal narrative. In Babel, humanity attempts to reach heaven through technology, building a tower that reaches the heavens, unifying efforts, resources, and language. It is a collective project of cosmic ambition. The divine response is not destruction, it is confusion. Languages are divided, communication is fragmented. The collective project becomes impossible. Again, the problem is not ambition, it is the lack of limits. It is the belief that there is no boundary that cannot be crossed, no domain that cannot be invaded. In Sodom and Gomorrah, the transgression is moral, but the result is the same: total destruction. Fire from heaven. Salt where civilization once stood. The biblical narrative emphasizes sexual perversion, but deeper readings point to something greater. A society that had completely lost any sense of limits, any respect for boundaries, physical, moral, social, spiritual. A civilization so advanced in its own decadence that there was no longer any possibility of redemption. Only the end. In Revelation, the pattern returns on a cosmic scale. Babylon, a symbol of civilization, commerce, technology, and knowledge, is destroyed not for lack of sophistication, but for its excess, for believing that there are no limits to what can be done, controlled, dominated. The apocalyptic Babylon is described in terms of absurd wealth, impressive technology, and global commercial control. It is the pinnacle of human civilization. And that is precisely why it is marked for destruction, because it has reached the point where it believes it needs nothing beyond itself, that it can function independently of any higher order, that it can redefine reality according to its own will. Few realize this. What the Book of Enoch preserves is not merely an ancient story about angels and giants. It is a structural warning about the relationship between knowledge, power, and responsibility. It is a warning that human consciousness can expand faster than our moral capacity to deal with it. And that when this happens, the result is not progress, it is collapse. This is not a specific religious belief. It is an observable pattern in multiple traditions, preserved in texts that were excluded precisely because they made this pattern too explicit. The question that remains is, why was this narrative forbidden? If it only reinforced the need for humility and limits, it should have been included in the canon. It should have been taught, preached, memorized. But it wasn't. And the reason is subtle, but crucial. Enoch not only warns against excessive knowledge, he also suggests that humanity was not designed to remain ignorant. The Watchers transgressed, yes, but they transmitted real knowledge. Metallurgy works, astronomy works, writing works, pharmacology works. The problem wasn't that the knowledge was false or evil. The problem was that it was transmitted out of the intended sequence. This implies that there is a correct sequence, that there is a path of development where knowledge could be acquired safely. That humanity was destined to learn these things eventually, but through a gradual process that allowed for parallel moral development. And this is dangerous for religious structures that base their authority on the exclusive control of interpretation and revelation. If humanity can acquire knowledge on its own, if it can evolve intellectually without institutional mediation, then religious authority loses its essential function. Enoch does not deny the existence of the divine, but he suggests that knowledge is not the exclusive property of heaven, that it can be accessed, discovered, built, that there is a natural path of human development that would eventually lead to the same discoveries that the Watchers prematurely transmitted, and that the danger lies not in knowledge itself, but in the lack of maturity to use it. This is subversive, because it shifts responsibility. We are not sinners simply for disobeying. We are responsible for learning how to use what we know. Save this part for the end. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that this interpretation was not fringe. The Qumran community was rigorous, disciplined, and deeply committed to observing the law. They lived in celibacy, shared common property, followed precise liturgical calendars, and practiced elaborate purification rituals. They were not crazy mystics or radical heretics. They were serious scholars, meticulous scribes, and sophisticated theologians, and they preserved the Book of Enoch. They copied its texts, studied its prophecies, and integrated its cosmology into their worldview. This means that, in Second Temple Judaism, there was room for multiple narratives about human origins. There was room for ambiguity, for complexity, for texts that did not offer simple answers, but that forced deep reflection on responsibility, knowledge, and power. There was room to ask whether humanity was prepared for what it knew, whether the knowledge we possessed was a blessing or a curse, whether our technological development had surpassed our ethical capacity to manage it. This plurality was lost, or rather, it was eliminated. Christian canonization and the rabbinical consolidation of Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple created orthodoxies that excluded texts like Enoch, not because they were heretical in a technical sense, but because they complicated narratives that needed to be simplified for mass consumption. The Church needed a clear narrative of sin and redemption. Sin was human. Salvation was divine. The path was obedience and faith. Introducing elements of celestial corruption, premature transmission of knowledge, and shared responsibility for the human condition complicated this narrative. It made the lines less clear. Rabbinic Judaism needed a clear narrative of law and obedience. The Torah was perfect, complete, sufficient. God had revealed everything that needed to be revealed. Following the commandments was the path to a righteous life. Introducing texts that suggested knowledge could be acquired outside of official revelation, that there were other sources of cosmic understanding, that the human condition resulted from more complex processes than simply disobeying a commandment, destabilized this structure. Enoch offered something more ambiguous, more challenging, more unsettling. So he was left out, but it never completely disappeared. The Ethiopian church preserved it. For them, Enoch was as sacred as any other biblical text. Quotations appeared in early Christian writings. Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, maintained traditions that echoed Enochian themes. In communities scattered around the world, fragments of this knowledge were preserved, transmitted orally, copied into rare manuscripts. And in the 20th century, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the importance of Enoch was finally recognized academically. Not as a historical curiosity, but as a testament to a crucial phase in the development of Western religious thought. A phase where the narrative about who we are and where we come from was still open, still being debated, still able to include complexity and contradiction. A phase where it was possible to ask whether humanity was prepared for what it knew without being accused of heresy. A phase where texts could preserve warnings about the dangers of unprepared knowledge without being immediately suppressed. What was lost with the exclusion of Enoch was not just a text. It was a way of thinking about the human condition, a way that recognized that knowledge is dangerous, that power corrupts, that technology without ethics breeds destruction, that consciousness without wisdom is catastrophic. These are not abstract religious lessons. They are historical observations. Every civilization that developed advanced technology without a corresponding ethical framework collapsed. Sumeria, with its urban sophistication and constant wars, disappeared. Babylon, with its towers and empires, was conquered. Rome, with its roads and legions, fragmented. European colonial empires, with their naval and industrial technologies, generated genocides and ultimately collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. Something was preserved outside the canon. Something was repeated in different cultures. Something always warned against the excess of knowledge. The Book of Enoch is no exception. It is exemplary. And what it preserves is more relevant now than ever. We live in an era where knowledge is more accessible than ever. Technology that once took generations to develop now emerges in years, months, weeks. The next passage connects everything and is almost never addressed. Artificial intelligence capable of surpassing human capabilities in specific tasks is already a reality. Genetic editing that allows for the modification of human embryos has already been tested. Climate manipulation on a large scale that can alter weather patterns is already being studied. Control of information on a global scale through algorithms that determine what billions of people see, think, and believe is already working. These are not fictional fantasies. They are present realities. And the question that no one is asking seriously enough is the same one that the Book of Enoch asked more than 2,000 years ago. Are we prepared for what we know how to do? The Watcher's narrative is a mirror. Beings with superior knowledge transmit that knowledge to a species that lacks the moral maturity to contain it. The result is chaos, violence, destruction, and the need for a forced restart. Today, it is not celestial beings who transmit knowledge. It is ourselves. Scientists, engineers, programmers, geneticists, we are the Watchers. And collective humanity, which now has access to tools for radical transformation, is pre-Diluvian humanity. The difference is that there is no external authority to intervene. There is no programmed flood. There is no guaranteed restart. If we collapse, it will be on our own account. The Book of Enoch was banned because it explicitly stated something that power structures prefer to leave implicit. Danger doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. We are not victims of malevolent external forces. We are responsible for how we use what we know. The ancient fear wasn't of angels or demons. It was of ourselves, of our capacity to create without considering consequences, to advance without questioning direction, to know without understanding. And this fear, which was codified in narratives of fallen angels and destructive giants, remains valid, because the pattern remains the same. Consciousness grows faster than moral wisdom. That is the essence of the Enochian warning. We can do things we cannot control. We can create consequences we cannot foresee. We can destabilize systems we cannot restore. And when we do this, there is no divine authority to save us. There is only us dealing with the consequences of our own choices. Enoch was not forbidden for speaking of angels. He was forbidden for speaking of responsibility, for making it clear that knowledge is not neutral, that power is not benign, and that technology without ethics is suicidal. Today, we defend technological advancement as inevitable progress. Questioning it is treated as reactionary or irrational fear. Any hesitation in the face of new technologies is labeled as ignorance, superstition, resistance to progress. But the Book of Enoch suggests that questioning is not fear. It is prudence. That asking, "Should we do this?" is as important as, "Can we do this?" That there are limits that should not be crossed, not because they are imposed externally, but because crossing them generates consequences that we do not know how to manage. This is not religious morality, it is historical observation. Every time humanity has advanced technologically without a corresponding ethical framework, the result has been catastrophe. Gunpowder was invented and used for war. Nuclear energy was discovered and transformed into bombs. Chemistry advanced and produced chemical weapons. Molecular biology progressed and created bioweapons. Each technological advance was immediately militarized, commercialized, transformed into an instrument of control or destruction. Not because of inherent evil in technology, but because of a lack of moral maturity to use it. The banning of the Book of Enoch was, in this sense, symptomatic. It was excluded not because it was wrong, but because it was uncomfortably right. Because recognizing that the problem is not knowledge, but our immaturity in dealing with it, would mean recognizing that not every advance is progress, that not every discovery should be applied, that there are times when we must choose not to do something, not because it is impossible, but because we do not know how to deal with the consequences. And this is unacceptable for civilizations that measure success by expansion, domination, and control. The pattern repeats itself. From Enoch to Babel, from Babel to Sodom, from Sodom to the apocalypse, the narrative is always the same. Humanity reaches a point of development where it believes there are no limits, that it can do anything, that it has mastered nature, matter, life, that you can reshape the world according to your will, that there are no consequences that cannot be managed. And at this point of maximum confidence, collapse happens, not as divine punishment, as a structural consequence, as an inevitable result of a system that has exceeded its capacity for self-regulation. And then the cycle begins again, with fewer people, fewer resources, less knowledge. Libraries burn, empires fragment, technology is lost. And slowly, over generations or centuries, knowledge is rebuilt. First, the basic techniques of survival. Then agriculture, metallurgy, writing, eventually astronomy, mathematics, philosophy. The cycle repeats itself, and each time, at some point, the same choice arises. Do we continue advancing without limit, or do we learn to question our own progress? The Book of Enoch preserves the memory of this cycle, not as a factual history of specific events, but as a timeless pattern, as a warning encoded in mythical narrative, as wisdom preserved outside the canon because the canon could not contain it without compromising its own structure. And the question that remains, that has always remained, is, will we listen? Or will we repeat the pattern once more, believing that this time it will be different, that this time we are prepared, that this time we will be able to control the consequences? It's not about literally believing in fallen angels or antediluvian giants. It's about recognizing the pattern, about seeing that the ancient fear of limitless knowledge is the same fear we should have today. That the warning about consciousness advancing faster than moral wisdom is not religious superstition. It is a historical observation repeated across multiple cultures, preserved in multiple texts, codified in multiple narratives. And ignoring it doesn't make us more advanced. It makes us more vulnerable. The truth about human creation preserved in the Book of Enoch is not that we were made by extraordinary beings. It is that we were made with the potential for self-destruction, that our capacity to know, create, and transform can both elevate and annihilate us, that there is no guarantee of progress, that history is not linear, that civilizations collapse not for lack of knowledge, but for an excess of it without a corresponding moral structure, and that this truth, because it is uncomfortable, was excluded from official narratives, not because it was false, but because it was too dangerous to be widely disseminated. Power structures, religious, political, economic, have always preferred narratives that reinforce their authority. Simple narratives, where good and evil are clearly defined, where obedience is rewarded and transgression punished, where knowledge comes from above and should be received with gratitude. Enoch offered something different. He offered a narrative where knowledge was problematic, where celestial authority had failed, where responsibility was shared, where there were no simple answers. This could not be integrated without compromising the entire system. So it was excluded, but not destroyed, because even those who excluded it recognized that there was something valuable in it, something that could not be completely erased. So it survived on the margins, preserved by communities that saw in it a truth that could not be lost. And today, when rediscovered, when studied academically, when its warnings are compared with our current reality, it resonates in a powerful way. We are creating artificial intelligence without fully understanding its implications. We are editing human genes without ethical consensus on the limits. We are developing autonomous weapons without a legal framework to control them. We are concentrating informational power in algorithms without transparency about how they work. We are advancing in all directions simultaneously, driven by commercial, military, and national competition, without pausing for collective reflection on where this leads us. We are the watchers, imparting knowledge to an unprepared humanity. Except that humanity is ourselves. There is no separation. There is no external authority to stop us. There is only us, choosing to continue or to stop, choosing to accelerate or to question, choosing to believe we are prepared or to admit that perhaps we are not. The Book of Enoch doesn't offer solutions. It offers warnings. It doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you what happens when you act without thinking. And this warning, preserved for over 2,000 years, excluded from the canon for being too uncomfortable, remains relevant. Perhaps more relevant now than at any other time in human history, because we have never had so much power. And we have never been so unprepared to use it. It's not belief. It's not modern theory. It's not manufactured fear. It's a pattern. It's repetition. It's a historical warning. The truth about human creation hasn't been lost. It has been forbidden because it has always demanded responsibility. And responsibility is what is most lacking when power is abundant.